All right, welcome everyone. This is week 4 of our ACM workshops, developing active assignments for the hybrid context and beyond. And before we get too far in, we thought we would just introduce ourselves, let you know who's here, and we'll start up in McAllister.
Hi, I'm Britt Abel. I am a faculty member in German Studies, and I'm also the Director of Writing for the college, and I use the pronoun she, her, hers.
Hi, my name is Robert Hink. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Monmouth College. In addition to last semester's mad dash to online teaching, I've also taught online courses for Central Michigan University in 2018 and 2019.
Hi, I'm Shweta. I'm Communication Across the Curriculum Coordinator at Monmouth College. I'm also an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department. And just like Robert, besides this crazy last semester, I have experience teaching online, and I have also experienced doing online writing consultations.
I'm not seeing Jane here. I'm Angela Zaskowski. I'm the Associate Dean of Faculty Development at Coe College. I also teach history and archaeology.
And I'll jump in here. I'm Jane. Sorry, I'm Jane Nesmith. I teach in the Rhetoric Department, and I'm the Writing Center Director.
And I'm Lisa Wiebinga-Stroschein. I'm Coe's academic technologist, and we're all really excited to be here. So our focus today is on 2 related frameworks, transparency and assignment design, and the application of some simple universal design for learning principles. We are including lots of examples as we progress through the morning. Our intention in this collective package workshop today and Thursday is that you'll design or revise some of your own assignments with these principles. And just a quick note, we are meeting on Thursday for our second session this week instead of Friday. Oops, if everybody could just mute quick, that would be awesome. We're meeting Thursday instead of Friday because of the Independence Day holiday. So we selected these 2 lenses because both build equity and accessibility into instruction. Both of them strive to help students get to and deeply understand the why and the how and the what of learning, and both encourage us to think of a variety of modalities when designing instruction. These practices help us explain our own motivations, and those motivations are even more important to present in an explicit way now that we might be thinking about presenting things online. So as we started building our content, before we delve too deeply, we started thinking about this concept of context over content. And this tagline, I guess we could call it, came from a year-long training at McAllister done by Dr. Jamie Washington, and it really makes sense here. If we start thinking back to the first week of the ACM workshops, we were with Devavani and Corinne talking about teaching and learning with care and hope. And this slide should look familiar. We started talking about the difference between survival brain and the learning brain, and understanding where our students and where we are coming from and starting from. In that first session, we also talked about putting ourselves at the center of the Venn diagram of teaching, pedagogy, and care. We talked about showing up, being ourselves, putting ourselves in the shoes of our students, wherever they might be. And of course, we also talked about being human first, professor second. So we just wanted to set that, keep that in mind as the underlying current as we move forward, the idea of context over content. Now that we've cleared that up, we're going to dive into the content. So I'm going to hand it over to Jane Nesmith, and she's going to start us off with transparent design.
Thanks, Lisa. I also have to remember that you have to unmute yourself if you want to talk on Zoom. So important theory to remember. So when our group began working on assignment design workshop, we knew that it was going to need to be, the workshop needed to be designed to benefit both those of us teaching face-to-face and those of us teaching online, and those of us who are going to be teaching a hybrid modality. So we quickly determined that one important resource was going to be the Tilt Higher Ed website. Now, Tilt Higher Education is a national development and research project that uses current research on how people learn to improve learning and teaching for college students and faculty. The name TILT is kind of whimsical, but it actually stands for Transparency in Learning and Teaching. So for us, the first principle for assignment design, whether online, hybrid, or face-to-face, is transparency. Next slide, please. So we have a question for you. What does transparency mean when it refers to human activity? So think about this for a bit, and then go ahead and add your thoughts, your definition into the chat. Okay, a word that keeps coming up is clarity. And not just clarity, but clarity for students. Students need to understand. I love openness, the word openness. So being open to our students about what they need to know. Clarity about expectations, no hidden agendas. Right, honesty about motives. Making the reasons visible. So, willing to say when things are not clear and to address the course. So excellent. It sounds like a lot of people have some great ideas about that. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And right here we have the definition of transparency from the TILT website. And what they say is transparent teaching and learning methods make explicit to students how and why they are learning course content in particular ways. So that idea of being explicit to our students so they know why it is that they're doing certain things in a certain way. And this is an important pedagogical approach, and it's particularly important when we might be meeting face-to-face with our students less frequently, so they have fewer opportunities to ask us questions. So it's especially important when we're going to be working in an online situation. Next slide, please. So why is transparency important? Well, you probably have some ideas about this already, but let me just tell you a little bit about it. The people who started the TILT website and that program, they identified a problem that we're familiar with, and that is that underrepresented first generation and low-income students are about half as likely to complete college in 4 years. And not only that, these researchers realized something we know, that is that even high achievement in high school can frustrate college success. So the issue was that we want there to be more college success. We want students to have successful learning experiences in college. And the TILT researchers wanted to know how to increase equity in learning so that there were opportunities for all students to achieve. Their hypothesis was that if instructors would apply transparent learning or teaching approaches, that students would have better learning outcomes. So in the study, their first study, they asked some instructors to apply just 2 small teaching interventions where they were more transparent about their assignments that they gave. And what they found is that there were multiple positive outcomes from those small changes to provide more transparency. There was more student satisfaction, there was more student engagement, final grades were better, and there was a number of things that came out during an end of the term assessment where they looked at a survey given to students, and also they looked at the products that the students created, the assignments that they did in the class. What they found is that students gained more confidence and sense of belonging when the professors were more transparent with their assignments. And those 2 are indicators for student success and persistence, very important in college. And the third thing is they noticed from looking at the things that the students worked on, the assignments, is that the students actually were beginning to master skills that employers seek. So transparency was good for every student. The gains were for every student, but first-generation students and underserved populations showed even greater benefits from being transparent. So we'll share, you can find more information, yes, we will share reference to that study in our list of resources. It's very interesting. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, yes, thank you. There we go. In the research study, those small interventions consisted of 3 elements, which have become the building blocks of transparency. So keeping in mind our definition of transparent, instructor discussion or explanation of these elements can have a positive effect on students' learning, especially those students who are unfamiliar with college success strategies. So the instructor talking about these 3 things: the purpose of the assignment, what it will look like when the students work on the task, and finally, what will a successful assignment look like? In other words, the criteria. So we're going to look at these elements one by one. Next slide, please. The purpose of the assignment, we usually know, right? And I admit that I often just assume that students will see this too. I mean, it's obvious to me, but most of our students, especially in lower level classes, but even throughout, they're novices in the area, so they may not be able to process the big picture of what's going on in the class. So that's why it's very important to make clear the purpose of the assignment. So there are some questions that the instructors should consider when discussing the purpose of the assignment with students, either in writing or in a conversation in class. They might talk about what skills the student's going to practice, or maybe they'll explain the value of those skills in a way that's accessible to everybody in the class. You might talk about where this assignment fits in the arc of the class, or how it might be relevant to students' lives outside the class. The researchers noticed fewer students saying that assignments were just busy work when this was applied. So I think that's a really good thing as well, that they don't see the work in the class as busy work, but as important. Next slide, please. Most of us are actually pretty good at describing what we want our students to do. And a lot of us are also good at explaining how we want students to work on projects. We may even have a series of sequenced assignments that walk novice learners through the steps they need to follow to have the kind of learning experience that's most beneficial. We do this because making the task clear to students can help students avoid wasting time by trying to figure out, well, how do I do this? Or how do I even start this? And instead just getting started. So being explicit in explaining to students how to work through the task can make the assignment more transparent. Now, some people might say, well, what if I don't want to tell the students how to go through it? I want the students to figure out their own approach to the assignment and do it on their own. I want their own creativity. I don't want to limit their creativity. Well, in such cases, faculty can preserve students' confidence and sense of belonging by adapting the way we explain the purpose of the assignment. For example, we might even just say, one of the purposes of this assignment is for you to figure it out on your own, how to do this. And because of that, you may struggle and feel confused. So being clear that the students might be struggling to do the assignment, it can be very beneficial and transparent. Next slide, please. So the third element for making our assignments more transparent is making our criteria for success clear to our students. There are many ways to do this. It doesn't have to be a rubric. We know that there's often a sharp divide in faculty for and against rubrics, but that's only really one way to help students see what success is. There's other things that you could do. You might share example texts. You might even annotate them, like say, hey, look at the way this thesis defines the scope and approach of this article's point of view. This is what you need to do in your own writing. Or you might say, you might just list the elements that you're going to look for in the assignment and let students know what you're going to look for. You also should probably think about what you emphasize in your criteria. Do you really want formatting of the text to be the most important thing, worth 50%? That's up to you. So it gives you a chance to think what's important. In addition, you can also think about criteria in terms of how specific it should be. For example, how much detail do you want for a short, low-stakes assignment? How much criteria detail do you want for a longer high stakes assignment? So that might differ. But what's important is that the students know what you consider success in this assignment, so they know where they're headed. And criteria, clarifying our criteria can actually help us as well. It can make grading faster because you spend time in advance to determine what's important. It can reduce the number of queries by students who might be confused about what to spend time on, or might be confused about the grade at the end. And it can also help you determine how your assignments will help students reach the learning objectives of the class as well. So in order to help you see how you might do this, I'm going to turn it over now to Shweta, and she'll share some examples of assignments that aren't particularly transparent and how they can be modified to make them more transparent.
Thank you, Jane. So it's easier to examine other people's work and see how all this criteria, the discussion on transparency fits there. And then after we examine this, we will look at an example where you will get some time to work on that example and work on someone else's draft. So to begin, let's take a look. Let's take 30 seconds to kind of skim through this example here from a psychology assignment where the paper is saying that your task is to explore a psychological topic. You need such and such font, double spaced. Please include your name in the header, title of the top of the first page, etc. And then there's a topic description and things that the instructor is requiring the student to do. Now, take a moment to think about, as soon as you get something like this, what's your focus? Usually, students focus on filling the 3 to 4 pages with information with this Times New Roman. Sometimes they also focus on adding spaces between paragraphs, making sure that when they put their name and they also put your name and the class name, and it fills up 3 to 4 lines up there. So that's how this is currently set up. And that's why even in face-to-face situations, this is not very functional. So let's see what we can do to modify the purpose. So if you look at this slide here, the highlighted section shows a revised purpose, and this is highlighting that the assignment is geared towards helping students to monitor their own beliefs, how they change throughout the semester. So here is a task that the purpose definition that gives some orientation towards the task to be done, and what does it mean to do this task to the student's learning experience, and how can they use it later in the semester. That's also mentioned in the definition of this purpose. So this is something that kind of relates to what we talked about earlier when Jane was explaining, when Lisa was explaining context over content. This is setting up the context. And like Jane said earlier, this shows the student that this is not just some busy work that's assigned to them to slog through and just turn in, get a grade, and move on. This has a larger purpose that fits in their learning timeline and other things that they're doing in the semester. So it's all the more important in online context to define a purpose like this, because they're not meeting you face to face, and they're unable to ask clarifying questions right away. That interactive element is kind of missing in the class. So you don't get to see that blank expression on their faces when they receive the assignment and then promptly explain the purpose in that interaction. So a lot of online teaching is to deal with previewing a lot of stuff, and this helps when you define the purpose this way, it helps to situate some of those things in the student's mind and helps them learn along. So we'll also examine how to specify tasks. But before that, I want to go to the slide previous, Lisa, please. The one that described the original assignment. So if you look at this slide, when the instructor says your task is to explore psychological topic in relation to your life, that's basically the only part which is setting up the context for the students, but the rest of it is about filling 3 to 4 pages, double spacing, Times New Roman, including the name, then addressing you to address the question, writing quality that's kind of vague. We don't know if every comma and period will be assessed, or the tone, the voice, or what is going to be assessed. Integrating outside sources, at least one quality source. What do we mean by the quality source? We don't know. So the task description here is not very helpful. If we jump on to the task, this modified task description, here we have specific questions that the students can examine, and there's a list of topics that they can go through, and this will help them achieve the purpose of examining how their beliefs change over the semester. So the specific tasks are kind of related to the purpose that was defined earlier. And again, it's easy to see that logical connection why students are doing this work, and helps them not to see this as just busy work, just something that they need to pass the class, but something that's going to help them build knowledge. They're creating knowledge out of this. And you may or may not want to be as specific, like Jane said earlier. It's sometimes useful to have this really specific task steps. Sometimes it's useful to give them this idea that this assignment is designed to help you explore something, and that's probably going to feel very uncomfortable in the beginning. It might feel confusing, but in the end, this is what you will achieve. So you instead of having these specific steps, you may say that you may have to spend 2 to 3 hours in the library exploring for some of this material, and in the process, it'll be useful for you to take random notes on the side. In the process, it might be useful to do some free writing of reflections of what you think of that material, and then it'll be useful, easy to integrate some of that information in your final paper. So you can be vague, you can be strategically vague, I would say. It's called strategic ambiguity in communication studies. So that again means that in order to be non-specific, in order to not just give the steps away to the students, in order to make sure that they do the job, it's not helpful to not give any information. It's helpful to be strategically ambiguous so that they still have a path to go through. So once you've defined the purpose, once you've outlined the list of tasks. I see something in the chat I don't understand. Isn't this paper essay? Yes, this is a paper and essay assignment, but these are the steps that will be useful for the students to think about when they're writing this assignment. So the next thing would be to define a criteria, like Jane specified, that it is useful to show the students what does success look like, because again, if you think of the original assignment description, it was saying you have to write a 3 to 4 page paper. If that description goes to the student, then most students who can fill 3 to 4 pages would expect that they would get a good grade because they were able to provide the information that was asked. In this case, it's useful to go deeper into the criteria, and I want to spend more time discussing different criterias, because that's helpful in adapting to the online mode as well. So I want to talk about explicit and implicit criteria here. Explicitly here, it's saying that you will be successful in this activity if you can provide an answer to all the questions that are listed here and provide feedback to a classmate. Now, the way this is set up here is implying that probably they're working on a draft here, and it's important to give feedback to each other, but it is not saying if a student has to incorporate that feedback before they submit to the instructor. So that clarity would be important. Do you want a revised draft, or like Jane was talking about earlier, are you scaffolding towards a final paper? So this is their draft work where they get feedback from the classmates and you, the instructor, and they're allowed to revise based on that feedback. If that is the case, then it may not be useful to dock points on, let's say, use of passive voice instead of active voice. Here, it will be more useful to give feedback and then look for those aspects in the next step of the assignment. So more often than not, we have some implicit criteria that we don't really specify in the assignment description itself. For example, for some instructors, it is almost a requirement that students write in active voice and avoid passive voice. For some instructors, it is important that every sentence is grammatically correct and there are no comma splices, etc. Well, if you've not mentioned that here, and you've not told this to the students in class, then they don't have that expectation registered in their minds. And again, it's specifically more important in online context because they are mostly reading these instructions or listening to your videos if you record videos. So it's important to have them noted somewhere so that it's not just an expectation in your mind, it's an expectation out there for the student to know while they're doing the assignment. Another thing to think about here is priorities in terms of what you want to grade in this assignment, because in online teaching, I'm sure a lot of us have experienced this last semester, it takes a little longer than what we do in face-to-face settings. So even grading takes a little bit longer. So establish a timeline for the students in terms of when they are supposed to submit these assignments to you. Then also establish a timeline for yourself in terms of when you will be able to turn it around after grading, and when will you be able to provide feedback. Feedback is important for learning, but even more so in online setup, because that interactive element is kind of missing. And that's the reason why it's important for you to make sure that you turn around the assignment, so that again the students don't feel that they're doing this assignment for just the sake of moving on one task after the other. Instead, they can use your feedback and use it for the next assignment. So make a timeline for yourself also, and based on that, decide what criteria is important for you. What feedback can you provide within that timeline? And the third thing I want to talk about is being cognizant of the campus resources. Do you want your students to use tutoring services? Do you want them to use the writing center? Have you given them enough time? Have you specified in the criteria that these are the things I want you to discuss with a writing tutor or a chemistry tutor or a math tutor to make sure that your work is fulfilling all the criteria that I want you to address? So a little bit later, Britt will talk about scaffolding some more, and talking about priorities and deadlines for feedback a little bit more. She'll expand more nuts and bolts kind of things on that. So this is basically, I want to reiterate that timing and predictability is the essence in online teaching. So in your criteria, you should be able to convey and communicate that these are the clear expectations. This is what success looks like. Some of the examples Jane talked about earlier, I just want to add one more example. I've used this in online teaching before, where I take a sample student paper and I do verbal video feedback on that paper and record it and upload it so that the students can see what goes through my mind when I'm reading a student paper and what is priority for me, and so that they can consume it and understand what is expected of them and deliver accordingly. So there's an interesting quote here on the screen. No passion in the world is equal to the passion to alter someone else's draft. So basically, we are looking at someone else's draft here, and we will try to implement some of the things that we have discussed so far. So you can take about 2 minutes to go through this prompt that's up there on the screen for you and see how would you modify this to identify purpose, task, and criteria for this particular assignment. So take your time and keep those ideas coming through the chat box. Okay, so for the sake of time, we have some really interesting things coming in here, but for the sake of time, we will move on. It's really interesting to see that a lot of you said it's unclear and we need more information. That's exactly how the students might feel, and that's exactly why it might be useful to be specific and add some of these things. So here it says the purpose of this activity is to illustrate the structure and foundation and function of state and federal court systems. And the task is giving steps in terms of we need groups. Groups should be of 2 to 3 students. Half of the class needs to do this. The other half needs to do the other task. And how much time the students will have to draw the general structure, what we will do when we come back as a group, and what will students do then? What is the criteria? So the students are supposed to compare the illustration of the course structure and functions to the organizational chart that the instructor is going to provide. And students must note corrections on the original diagram. The diagram will be graded and returned to students in the next class, setting up the timeline, setting up expectations. It will be even more useful to include something that puts students' anxiety to rest in terms of, are you going to grade based on their attentiveness to the corrections, or you're expecting certain corrections? Is there a correct, so to say, version that you're expecting here? That might be useful to include. And the other thing, for example, in this case, this is a class activity. How are we going to do this online? What modifications we need to do when we need to work on this online? One thing that we all need to be cognizant of when we are moving assignments online is to remember that the internet is available to the students. That is a fact, and the assignments need to be repurposed in terms of what is your purpose. Is your purpose in this assignment is to assess memory recall? That's not going to happen with internet around there. So or is your purpose that the students explore the facts on their own and they're able to articulate them in a certain manner? So this is where criteria comes into action, and it's really important for you to make sure that you're addressing some of these needs in terms of criteria. And to further illustrate how all of this looks like when you adapt your courses from face-to-face to online, I will turn it over to my colleague Robert here, and he'll walk us through some of the steps that he has taken before and how does it look like when you adapt.
So the purpose of this presentation here is to take the principles of transparent teaching and make them more concrete by placing them into the context of online learning and show what this might look like with regards to assignments and syllabi. And so I want to state at the very beginning here that my goal isn't to provide this one-size-fit-all design, but instead to provide you all with the foundation upon which you can build your own courses within the context of your own specific learning goals here. So what does effective online learning look like, and how is this related to transparent teaching? Well, as Lisa had mentioned earlier in the presentation, for those of you who were dialing in, context is really important to keep in mind. Indeed, when we think about how many hours of acculturation our students have experienced growing up in face-to-face classrooms, and then compare that to how many hours they've had in online context, you can see that there's a pretty dramatic difference there. So when moving to remote learning, it's essential to recognize this contextual shift and ask yourself, how are you designing your courses and assignments to fit within this new situation? Specifically, online pedagogy emphasizes the need to create predictable and stable learning environments to mitigate the confusion and newness of remote education, moving from that survival brain set to that learning mind. So employing transparent teaching principles in your own class design and assignments can help further these goals. And so in the next 10 to 15 minutes here, I'll provide some specific examples of what this looks like. So the first step is examining what assignments you typically employ and determining the underlying purpose that you are trying to fulfill in assigning them. Now, if you cannot identify one, perhaps that's a sign that you may want to cut that assignment as you move online. It's also important to note that not all of our assignments easily translate to online learning, and in many cases, our tendency to assign more work to compensate for moving online may lead to cognitive overload and undue stress for our students, as well as ourselves, especially if this creates more graded work. Remember, context over content. So if we look at the assignments or the tables I have presented here, the table on the left shows the assignments that I normally require in my organizational communication class. In this case, the purpose of my reading homeworks is simply to ensure students read the assigned reading before each week before coming to class. The 3 papers, they're intended for students to practice their writing skills and to apply our course concepts to real organizations they are part of. And during class, we discuss and engage in activities to further reinforce these concepts. However, when reflecting on these assignments, I realized that some of my learning purposes could be better met through some online tools. So when switching to an asynchronous remote class, for instance, I no longer need students to come with a printed copy outline of their reading homework. So instead, I set up weekly reading quizzes where students had to identify which course concepts best describe the example provided. In this case, students actually demonstrated more than just comprehension of the concepts like they would in my reading homeworks, but also application. Second, and perhaps more obviously, our ability to meet as a class to engage in my normal in-class activities and discussions were no longer feasible. So to simplify things while still meeting my underlying learning goals, I created weekly case studies where students had to analyze and apply our course concepts with an emphasis on providing a clear thesis, evidence, and reasoning to back up their claims in creative ways, thus effectively meeting the purpose of my longer papers, and in doing so actually better adapted the assignment online, where that in normal situations, students often feel overwhelmed by writing these papers, which would likely worsen once we move to remote learning. But by adapting them to discussion posts, I in essence broke them down into more manageable pieces, albeit more frequent. Furthermore, to simulate our course discussions and keep students connected to their classmates throughout the semester, I also required them to comment on students' posts. So here they're able to see how other students broke the cases down, allowing for further reflection and exploration of alternative means to meet the assignment. Now you might ask yourself, how does this tie into transparent teaching? Well, just like how I've taken a couple minutes to explain to you the purpose of my assignments, I similarly explain this to my students, in fact, usually in greater detail, including the justifications of deadlines and how all these assignments supported the larger learning goals of the course, which I'll now touch upon in the next slide here. So not only is it important to explain to students the purpose of your online assignments, but it's also important to be transparent and explain to them what that overarching logic or purpose of your course design is to help acculturate them to this online learning and create some buy-in so students understand what work is required of them, when, and why. In this case, you really want to think about how in advance you can set up this predictable and stable learning environment to ensure that your students succeed. And so that's what this slide tries to show. It provides an example of how I tried to take these new online assignments and adapt them into this new course calendar here. And so with these new assignments in mind, I made sure I created this consistent and predictable deadlines. In this case, each week, students have 3 tasks. Every Tuesday by midnight, they had to post their initial analysis of the case study. By Friday, they had to have posted by midnight at least 2 comments on other students' posts. And on Saturdays, by midnight, complete an online reading quiz. This provided some flexibility in that students could choose when to complete these assignments or if they wanted to complete them ahead of time, depending on their schedules, while also still making sure that we had these clear, understandable, and predictable deadlines. Furthermore, I explained why these deadlines were necessary. So for instance, why a student might ask, why do I need to create my post by Tuesday night? Or can I have an extension on this post? Well, by explaining to those students that their classmates need time to respond to other classmates' posts, and in order to make sure that that student didn't fall behind, you can explain how these deadlines are necessary and build upon each other. So in this case, in order to write your discussion post or to give your response by Friday, you need to make sure that you have your post up by Tuesday. In addition, in this case, assignments were also spaced out throughout the week. And so this helps keep students engaged throughout that week, which is also an important element when moving online here. Now, one tip that I'd highly recommend is setting up the first week as a trial period or an extra credit week. Here, basically, you offer extra credit for those who complete a substantive discussion post and perhaps a syllabus quiz using the normal deadlines, which in turn helps students familiarize themselves with the learning management system or online tools that you're using. In addition, it also allows them an opportunity to receive some feedback from you in a very low stakes activity here. So in the next few slides, I'm going to briefly touch upon some specific examples of how a specific assignment design within this overarching course schedule maps onto some of the principles of transparent teaching that we discussed in the workshop here. So I won't be able to go into much detail, and yes, I violated some key best practices for PowerPoints here with fewer words and less words, but I wanted to provide all this text up here so you can actually see what some of these assignments look like. So let me say, I won't be able to read through line by line all these assignments. They're up here so that you can spend your own time and read them in detail, break them down as you best see fit. So instead, I'm going to highlight some of the key takeaways that you can use when employing transparent teaching principles in these online assignments and course setup here. So this slide shows an example case study I created for one of my weekly discussion posts. You'll notice that I introduced the case. I then explained their overarching goal of applying course concepts and making an argument analyzing the situation, and the purpose of those comments when posting on other classes' discussion posts being that they're supposed to further that conversation. They're supposed to be challenging, affirming, bringing up new evidence, new connections, so that it's not just a very superficial comment of, oh, that's interesting or something like that. And so by explaining these underlying purposes, I kind of meet that transparent teaching principles here. So 2 key takeaways though and best practices that you might keep in mind as you set up your online courses are first asking yourself how you can construct your assignments as opportunities for students to apply their knowledge rather than simply regurgitate it. And second, how can you create similar assignment formats so that students can repeat the same foundational skills to new contexts or new cases? In this case, for my organizational communication class, all of our weekly discussion posts are pretty similarly constructed, just with a new set of course concepts and a new situation. So this allows students then to focus on learning rather than grappling with these new and confusing assignment types. This next slide shows the prompt I provided regarding the same discussion post that I showed just a slide above, describing and emphasizing what their specific task is. Now, you may notice that this also includes some of those elements of criteria as well. As the descriptions here show, I break down specific directions for how I expect them to apply their knowledge, and both things to avoid and some specific steps to follow. And so here, while many of you might be concerned with providing too much direction or giving your students the answers, you'll note that in these assignment descriptions, I explain this underlining task in ways that still allow room for creative thought. So instead, it's focusing more on these underlining skills, such as applying concepts and strong argumentative writing, rather than just a step-by-step prescription for how to approach this specific problem. Now, this case study evaluation was also included in the assignment descriptions that describe the actual case-specific study that they're looking at. And so in this case, they both know what the purposes or the specific case study, in addition to knowing how they're going to be evaluated here. And this evaluation is the same for all of the case studies that I present. All right, finally, and perhaps most helpful, or at least in my view, with my experience teaching online courses, is this idea of criteria, but specifically this idea of criteria that's tied to providing feedback. And so clear feedback and examples of what success looks like are really important here for online learning, because it's really easy for students to get depressed or confused or check out if they don't quickly understand what it is that's expected of them when they're sitting at home on their computers here. So the examples on this side, they represent my initial feedback following the extra credit trial week that I had in my organizational communication class. So in this case, students had the opportunity to write a discussion post, and afterwards, I provided an example both to those who participate in this extra credit opportunity and those who didn't, regarding what a more successful response might look like. And so in this case, the way that I set this up was after that first extra credit discussion post, after I graded that, I sent out a lengthy email to the entire class, summarizing the key patterns or themes I saw in these responses, both those more successful responses and those less successful responses, while also making sure to balance some supportive communication and things to improve. Doing so, and by sending this out to the entire class, allows you to save some time in terms of you're able to provide lengthy comments to the entire class without having to do so for each individual student's post. And so this initial in-depth example of how you evaluate these assignments and providing examples of this helps you save some of the time while also allowing students to visualize what the success looks like. And so attached in this first email that you see in the middle here was an example response and explanation then of what this example response's grade was and why it earned that grade. More importantly though, it shows what revisions would be needed to make it more complete. And so the far right example is an example of a post, with the bolded text being the additions of what they would need to do in order to fulfill the assignments and earn full credit for it. Now, I don't provide and break this down for every week. Indeed, after the first 2 weeks, I expect students to understand the criteria and the expectations. But again, by investing this time up front, students learn the how and the why of the assessment process regarding what grades they earn. So finally, a couple key tips here. When moving online, it's important to grade and return work quicker to students, especially before the next assignment is due, so that students can learn and improve. This quick feedback is essential for them to understand what those tasks are. Second, you want to think about to what extent you can create a common list of comments regarding recurring issues to help you grade in a more efficient manner. So some people might not like discussion boards because they feel as if there's a lot of grading going on. Now, keep in mind, this replaced the 3 larger papers that I had. And so in this case, it might be a net no loss or benefit in terms of time grading. But in addition, although I didn't provide lengthy feedback after each week, I still provided 3 to 4 sentence feedback based on the 3 criteria established in the assignment to each student. But in doing so, I kept basically a reservoir of common problems in terms of missing a thesis statement, or unclear details or examples are good, but still a little ambiguous. And so keeping those common recurring feedback responses can sometimes save you time when you're grading through all of this. All right, so at this point, you might ask me, does this really work? Is this just another theory or thing to read about to help us inform our pedagogy? And so what I have here are some example student feedback from the end of the semester course evaluation. So these are anonymous. These questions are the exact same end of the semester questions that students are asked every single class, whether online or not online. And what you can see, or what I would hope you can see from the underlying text here, is that the students are able to pick up and perceive this predictability, this stability, and not only does that help them follow what they need to be doing throughout the class, but it also helps them provide through feedback and better learn, making the switch to that online context more easily than otherwise would be possible. All right, so finally, let me share with you some final last thoughts. So first, in summary, what I kind of hope that you take away from this brief presentation is to find ways in which you can adjust your assignments to online learning environments that still meet your underlying goals, explain those goals to your students in a transparent manner, and set up consistent assignment types with consistent deadlines with lengthy initial feedback so that students can see what success looks like. This, if you can succeed, if you have the time to design these practices and actually employ them, can help students acculturate to this online new environment, which will then hopefully further enhance and enable their better learning here. Second things that I want to leave you with here is remember that online teaching is just fundamentally different from face-to-face context here. And so this isn't a negative or a positive, it's just different. And so if you're able to reflect and adapt on your own pedagogical goals, you may find actually more evidence of student success, and that each student has the space and the time to apply their knowledge in creative and impactful ways. So in this case, we can actually see if you create this stability and predictability, students are able to learn rather than adapting to their new context. And so then if you are able to find these common assignments, you might actually be able to help find recurring tools or assignments that help students consistently reinforce these key skills, whether it be argumentative or application skills or other skills that you're trying to highlight in different disciplines here. Furthermore, you can also try and develop ways to keep students consistently engaged, interact with their classmates, and not feel overwhelmed. In this case, I think those discussion boards, whether we like them or not, are a really important tool that students can, maintain that relationship with their classmates, although in an asynchronous time frame here. So with that, thank you for your time. Again, sorry for the technological issues earlier. I hope you found this presentation useful. In addition to this recording, I've also typed up a summary of these principles that should be sent out and available on the Slack channel. So again, thank you for your time here. And with that, I will end this.
In this first half of the workshop, we've talked a lot about our first principle for assignment design, transparency. Now we're going to move on to the second principle, Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. And in this second, much shorter section of the workshop, we'll discuss not only what UDL means and implies, but we'll also talk about a few simple strategies to apply it to assignments and assignment design. So we're going to talk through a few examples, including some of your own, before we move on to discuss our action item before Thursday's breakout groups. So next slide, please, Lisa. The myth of UDL is that it only pertains to students with disabilities, but the truth is that UDL is about thinking through learning design in a way that acknowledges the barriers in the learning environment and attempts to mitigate those barriers from the outset in the course and assignment design. This mitigation helps all learners while also reducing the need for individual accommodations. So in other words, UDL guides specific course and assignment design elements to ensure all students have access to all course elements. And I'm going to explain this with a physical example on the next slide. Automatic doors. Universal design for learning comes from universal design principles, removing physical barriers to build accessibility into building design. And while automatically opening doors were created to help people in wheelchairs and people who use walking aids, they have increased accessibility for non-disabled people as well. And I know we all see this, right? We use that extra button like with our elbows, right? Especially now when our hands are full. Parents use them if they have a baby stroller with them. And the people who take advantage of automatic doors the most right now are Amazon delivery staff, right? I would like to take this moment to cite Kirsten Bailing and Thomas Tobin's book, Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone, Universal Design for Learning in Higher Education, because much of my understanding of UDL, including some specific examples like this one, come from the book, which I highly recommend. Next slide, please. So I'm guessing the question in your mind right now is, do I need to redesign my whole course? No, you do not. We are going to explore 3 simple hacks that will go a long way towards making your course more universal and accessible through your assignments. A caveat though, this doesn't mean you shouldn't consider a broader range of design elements. We're going to talk about assignment design in general and not about the nitty-gritty of accessibility and UDL. So what we'd like you to think about, though, of course, is the accessibility of your course materials. UDL practices also indicate that your PDFs should be screen reader friendly, your videos should have closed captions, and your prints or hard copy text should be available in other formats as might be needed for a diverse population of learners. So we recommend that you talk to your local instructional technologists or with staff members in disability services about resources to help you with those more basic requirements. What we're going to talk about today are these 3 assignment ideas, starting with the next slide. So first, modality. Can you add a modality to your assignment? So for example, could you have a student film a short video or an audio response to a text or to a film rather than submit a written reaction? So you probably don't remember from the introductions, but I'm the director of writing for the college. So I teach writing courses, and of course the assignments have to be written in many cases. That is the bottom line objective of many of my courses, building writing skills. So of course my assignments have to be written. There's no moving on that. However, there are some scaffolding steps in the writing process that could be done in alternative formats in my classes. So, for example, when my students are preparing for a film sequence analysis, they could watch their film clip and record themselves just using their cell phone. They can record themselves speaking about what they see in the sequence to build ideas and to brainstorm for their written work. I could also have students work in pairs to talk through their sequences before they sit down to write. So each of these examples brings in another modality, even though the final assignment takes a written form. On the flip side, you might consider, we're not there yet, Lisa, sorry. We're still going to talk about modality. On the flip side, you might consider describing an assignment in alternative or multiple formats. So you could provide not only a written assignment prompt, but also a short video assignment prompt. And this not only builds accessibility into your assignment, but it also builds student engagement and connection in an online or hybrid environment. And here I'm going to give a call out to Flower Darby and Small Teaching Online. She talks about how making short videos really helps build a sense of connection and community in the online teaching environment. I also want to just note, you may have heard the phrase +1 in conjunction with UDL. That just means add 1 additional modality to an assignment or to your content delivery, and that addition goes a long way towards building accessibility. Next slide, please, Lisa. Yes, and now we're going to talk about scaffolding. Many of us already do this, right? We scaffold our bigger assignments. That is, we think through the steps that are required to complete an assignment. So we might break a longer research paper into pieces, such as an annotated bibliography, a topic proposal, a lit review, a method section, a thesis statement, a rough draft, a revision, all these pieces, right? And I think we've seen how scaffolding, this strategy of breaking apart a long assignment, leads to a better final product. But you might also think about how to be transparent in the steps of each of these elements, thinking about how one goes about compiling an annotated bibliography, for example. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to collect and grade each little step. Please don't, right? But you might outline this process for your students. The University of Washington has a really excellent UDL website that discusses the importance of providing cognitive supports. They suggest, for instance, that you could offer outlines, summaries, graphic organizers, and other scaffolding tools to help students learn. And one example of this might be our workshops here. I'm not sure that we did this today, but I know last week the workshop, for the workshop on syllabus design, we had access to the slides in as we were doing the workshop. So that means we had an outline of the presentation to help us structure our notes, as well as to structure our own learning experience. That's one example of a cognitive support that can really help your students. So this strategy might require you to take a step back and to think really explicitly about how you go about doing a task that you take for granted, such as compiling a bibliography. We know how to do that. Our students don't always know how to start. And so a cognitive support, an outline that walks them through those steps, either in written form or in oral form, could really build accessibility and transparency into assignments. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to talk about assessment with a callback to a lot of the things that Sweta mentioned in her portion of this presentation. I want to encourage you to think explicitly about whether your assessment criteria matches what you think is important in the assignment. Are you assessing what you mean to assess? So if you have assessment criteria that dock a grade for every hour that an assignment is late, then you're assessing timeliness. That's basically what it's going to come down to. If you are giving a timed test, then you are assessing speed. Can the student finish the exam or the quiz in the time that's allotted to them? And that might indeed be what you want to assess, or it might be a portion of what you want to assess. But otherwise, can you be flexible about a particular deadline, or can you give an untimed test? Think about what is truly important about this assignment. Another example is something similar to what Sweta said. If you deduct points for every grammar error, then what you're assessing is grammar and mechanics. You might remember I'm also a professor of German studies. I teach language courses. There is a time and a place for this. But I do want you to just think again and again, what is your learning outcome? And ask yourself, for instance, if your learning outcome, if the basic objective of an assignment is for a student to create an argument, can you understand that argument even if the writer makes a few minor errors? So think about this when you're weighing different grading options and thinking about weights of categories within a rubric or a checklist or whatever criteria you use. Another way of putting this is, what message do you send to your students with your assessment criteria? So you want to think through those assessment criteria and make sure that the bulk of the assessment has to do with the explicit learning outcomes. What is the bottom line for you? So I want to be clear, I'm not trying to argue that you should sacrifice elements that are crucial for your course or your assignment. I'm just suggesting that you truly weigh what's important in your assignment. as you grade it. And here I want to just follow up with a short excursus on deadlines, because I know this is going to come into a play for a lot of us at Macalester. We're moving from full semesters to half semesters. We're freaking out. How are we going to do everything we need to do in a short amount of time? So I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be hard deadlines, but I would argue in some transparency around deadlines. You might explain to your students that certain deadlines are non-negotiable, either because the students need to have completed that assignment before they go on to the next step, or, and this is a big or because you need that assignment at a specific time so that you can get the grading done. That is a totally wonderful and logical reason for a hard deadline. I just suggest that you share that with your students. Next slide, please. All right, we're moving on to the practice session. And this suggestion also comes from Bailing and Tobin's Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone. They suggest that one way to start integrating UDL components is to identify an assignment that your students have typically struggled with. So you think about that assignment. What do students struggle with and why? How might you tweak that assignment to make it clearer and more accessible? Could you add a modality? Could you build in additional steps to make the process clearer, perhaps by providing an outline of steps or a cognitive support? Could you adjust your assessment criteria? Perhaps students struggled because they were focused on one aspect of the assignment and your grading emphasized another aspect or another element of that assignment. So I'm going to set my handy dandy timer for 90 seconds here while you think. And then I'd love to see some examples of the chat. What is a tweak that you could make to this assignment? And I'll give you a hint, a clue, or just another example. My thinking through my sequence analysis and how I could build in different modalities into the pre-writing exercises or the preparatory exercises for this essay is one such example. That's something that came directly out of my reading of this book and of thinking about UDL. So take a little bit of time and then I will look forward to taking a look at the chat.
So we want to say thank you. We want to ask that if you have additional questions that you write them down now while they're still fresh in your mind to bring to your breakout sessions. And please access the worksheet and think about an assignment that you want to bring to the workshop on Thursday. And feel free to reach out to any of the 6 of us if you have questions or want to follow up on anything. And we will of course, post all the links that have been shared in the session, and the presentation will also go up on the Slack site. And so thank you very much from all 6 of us.